Well, I would say for two main reasons. First of all, we live in a society that is completely saturated with media. What we do, there was a media sociologist by the name of Todd Gitlin who wrote a book called Media Unlimited about a decade ago, where he argued that basically what we do as a society is consume media. From the minute that we wake up in the morning to the minute we go to sleep, we wake up to clock radios, we get on our phones and we scroll through social media, we may watch the news over breakfast, and then we're listening to the radio in the car, and then we're on our computers at work, and then at night we go to a movie or we play video games or we interact with people on social media. We consume media constantly. It is omnipresent, and yet we don't often reflect on the role of media in our lives and whose interest media and media industries are designed to serve, right? And they're generally designed to serve a handful of elite interests. Most of our media are for-profit. Most of them are advertising supported. And so, to understand how this omnipresent force in our lives operates is really important for everyone. The secondary reason is that we're all citizens in a nominal democracy. And as citizens, right, it's incumbent on us to be informed about public issues, to be informed about not just about the candidates we vote for, because that's a very impoverished notion of democracy, that democracy is simply about voting. We need to know about the issues facing us as a society, issues of war and peace, environmental sustainability, gender-based violence, etc. And our corporate media do a very poor job, generally, of informing us about those issues. They obsess about the kind of the horse race between candidates from the two major parties. Who's ahead? Who's behind? We constantly get reports about the polls, but they very rarely tell us about the issues at stake in elections or the issues at stake in public debates in our society. So I think those are the two real reasons that critical media literacy is just vital, right? Because we depend on the media, right, for information on those issues that concern us all as citizens, and because we as a society are saturated with media. Okay, so I would say independent journalism is absolutely essential. I am in awe of what, say, and I'll just pick one publication as representative, The Intercept is able to do with a fraction of the resources of the big corporate media, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox, or New York Times, the Washington Post. They're consistently able to investigate stories that are just mind-blowing and also incredibly consequential that are just getting completely passed over by the corporate media. So the example that I will give is the 9-part series that was published by The Intercept last year entitled The EPA Exposed, about how the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is required by law to publicize information about chemicals that scientists have concluded pose a threat to human life or to human health. They're required to post these on the EPA website. And what this investigative report discovered is that of the 1,200 or so chemicals that the EPA received reports about, only one was publicized on their website. In fact, the EPA's own scientists were having trouble getting these substantial risk reports, finding these substantial risk reports, because they weren't in the databases. And of course, the reason that happened was because under the Trump administration, Trump tried to muzzle the EPA and to censored the website. There were lots of cases of this. But the Biden administration hadn't really done anything about reversing that. After the fact, it took a group of employees of the EPA to bring a lawsuit to force the EPA to disclose this information and to return it to the website. This is a story that the New York Times, the Washington Post, any of the broadcast media could easily have covered. And they had more resources to cover those stories, and they actually have lawyers who could protect the journalists who are doing those investigations, and for whatever reason they didn't. So I think the independent media is important because, first of all, they're not beholden to anyone. They're not beholden to owners. They're usually, in some cases maybe, but they're usually not beholden to big money owners with other business interests. They're not beholden to advertisers. Yes, the reporters for independent news organizations sometimes develop close relationships with sources. That's inevitable for any journalist, but it's not the same kind of Stockholm syndrome, captive, relationship, the dependent relationship of dependency that you see so often with the Washington press corps, where they're utterly dependent on sources in the Pentagon or in the White House, and so they're terrified of offending those sources, for fear of losing access. Because that's what their careers depend on. Independent journalists are much more willing, I think, to report stories that might offend the powerful. So for all of those reasons, I think independent journalism and independent news organizations are vitally important. Well, I think it's crucially important because, there is a school of thought that says that if people are taught to view news, corporate, mainstream commercial news, with skepticism, then that it just feeds a sort of cynicism that people have about public life, and that will lead people to turn off to involvement in politics. And I don't think that that's the case. What I have witnessed is when students of mine start to develop a critical consciousness about news media, it actually piques their curiosity about social movements that are fighting for justice that may not get coverage in the corporate news media, and become more committed to being involved citizens. So I think it sort of has the opposite effect of what some critics of critical media literacy suggest, that it actually encourages people to get involved. Just on a very concrete level, in terms of an election year, there are every year stories that relate to elections that do not get reported in the corporate news media. We're all familiar now with the case of George Santos, who got elected as a Republican representative to Congress from Long Island on the basis of a completely fabricated background. He lied about his education, he lied about his ethnicity, he lied about his accomplishments in business and so on. And now we know that he was sort of using these lies to kind of embezzle money from the Republican Party. So, this is a story that should have been, researched, should have been investigated by the big corporate media. I mean, Long Island is, 30 miles from the center of the American media system in New York City, and yet somehow they missed that story. And I will tell you that I was involved in an organization called Chicago Media Action. And we once, this is now, 15 years ago, brought a challenge to the license renewals of every television station in the city of Chicago when they were up for a renewal before the FCC, on the basis of a study that was done that found that they devoted less coverage to local elections than they did to sports or weather, right? And that was in an election year. And in fact, in election year, there are city council races, state legislative races, not just top of the ballot races. The only races they covered were races for Senate and governor. And the other races were just invisible on television. And broadcasters have a requirement to serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity. They have an obligation to provide information to citizens, and we found that they weren't doing that. We brought a challenge. Of course, the FCC turned us down, but they kept their licenses. My primary issue of concern is that we will not have, but first of all, my biggest issue of concern is that we won't have a real choice at the ballot. And I'm not just talking about the presidential election, although I think that's what everybody thinks about the minute they think about elections. My primary concern is down the ballot, we're not going to be faced with choices, because even though we call our political system a democracy, if you look around the country, there's only a handful of truly competitive races. Because in most places, districts have been gerrymandered in such a way that seats in the legislature or in the city council or in Congress are gerrymandered as safe seats, right? So they're safe for one party or another, and this is by design. So I'm concerned, first of all, about the fact that people won't be faced with real choices when they go to the ballot. Secondly, I'm concerned about people's ability to exercise the right to vote, because all over the country, especially in Republican-dominated so-called red states, there are all these voter suppression laws that have been passed that require people to present a certain form of ID, that disenfranchise people who have been convicted of a felony, etc. And these are incredibly racist. So they're designed to suppress the black vote primarily, but also votes by immigrant groups and so on, people who are naturalized immigrants. I'm very concerned about that. I'm concerned about the fact that people will not be able to exercise the right to vote. And then finally, to circle back to the media, I'm concerned about how our media system, which is so obsessed with sensationalism, a corporate media system, so obsessed with sensationalism, and has such sort of skewed priorities in the way that it frames political debates, is going to cover the election. I will be honest that there have been elections where I can't even bear to watch television news or listen to commercial radio news, or even pick up certain newspapers, just because of the kind of idiotic way that they are framing the discussions and the debates, where they're just missing crucially important issues of environmental sustainability, peace, right, and anti-imperialism. Every year we have, or every time there's an election, we have an opportunity to have a debate, for example, about whether or not we want a military that is funded, that has a budget of $870 billion a year, whether or not we want to send almost $1 trillion to the Pentagon to pay for weapons systems in many cases that frankly don't work. Right? They don't. It's well known. It's well known that they don't work. So that is an issue that is never ever debated, right? Whether or not we should cut quote unquote defense spending, and that's a euphemism. It's military spending. Whether or not we should cut weapons spending is something that is just not debated, and the corporate media is complicit in that, because they don't ask the reporters when they have a chance to confront politicians or candidates for office, do not ask those tough questions. And so that's my next big concern.